Hey there. So if you're managing a fleet of vehicles, chances are you're using some kind of tracking system. But are you sure you're navigating the pretty complex rules of GDPR the right way? Today, we're going to break down exactly what you need to know to drive compliance. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's just get right to it with a really direct question. Because the second you start tracking a company vehicle, you're not just looking after an asset anymore. You're handling personal data. And that means you've just stepped right into the world of data protection law, where the stakes are, well, incredibly high.
So here's our game plan. We're going to break this down into 5 key parts. Think of it as your roadmap to getting this right, making sure you know exactly what's required to protect your business and your employees.
So what is the big deal here, really? Well, it's actually pretty simple. The moment a vehicle is tied to a specific employee and you start tracking its location, it stops being just about company property. From that point on, it's a data protection issue. And here's the absolute core of it. Under GDPR, that location data is considered personal data. Why? Because you can link it directly back to an identifiable person, your driver. You see, you're not just tracking a van, you're actually processing information about a human being.
And if you get it wrong, well, the penalties are designed to hurt. We're talking a maximum fine of 20 million euros or 4% of your company's global revenue, whichever one is higher. I mean, that's a risk no business, big or small, can afford to just ignore.
All right, so before you can process any data, GDPR's Article 6 says you have to have a valid legal reason for doing it. It's called a legal basis. Now, for employers, this usually comes down to 2 main options.
So on one side, we have legitimate interest, which basically means the tracking is necessary for a valid business reason. On the other side, there's consent. Now you might think, oh, I'll just get consent, that's the easy way. But for an employer, that's a legal minefield. Let me show you why. You don't have to take my word for it. This quote from the Irish Data Protection Commission just nails it. Think about it. Can an employee really give free consent to their boss without feeling at least a little bit of pressure? Regulators say no, they can't. That power imbalance makes consent basically invalid, so legitimate interest is almost always the right lane to be in.
Okay, so you've established legitimate interest as your legal basis. Great, but what are the rules of the road now? Well, your tracking has to be necessary, it has to be proportionate, and it has to be tied to a very specific legitimate purpose.
So it all comes down to why you're tracking. Tracking a van to prove a delivery was made? Totally fine. Using GPS to find a stolen vehicle? Of course. But using that same data to constantly nitpick someone's driving speed for their annual review? Nope, not okay. And tracking them after they've clocked out for the day? Absolutely not. You have to stick to the original reason you said you were tracking them for.
And this quote really drives the point home. The technology is there to track the company's asset, the vehicle itself. It is not a tool for general surveillance of your people. That's a really critical line you cannot cross in your policies or in your day-to-day operations.
Now, this brings us to something that's totally non-negotiable. If an employee is allowed to use a company vehicle for their own personal time, you are legally required to give them a way to turn the tracking off. A privacy switch isn't a nice-to-have, it's a must-have. It respects their fundamental right to a private life.
All right, let's switch gears and talk about dashcams. These add a whole other layer of complexity because they can be way more intrusive, especially when you start talking about recording audio. And the rule here could not be clearer or more direct. Audio recording has to be off by default. Capturing private conversations inside a vehicle is extremely intrusive, and you'd need an incredibly good, exceptional reason to do it. For pretty much everyone, the answer is just don't.
So if you are using dashcams, you've got to run through this checklist. Be super transparent with clear signs inside the vehicle. If you ever use audio, make sure it's only for triggered, exceptional events. Be ready to pull that footage if an employee asks to see their data. And always make it crystal clear who's in charge of the data and how to reach them.
Now, before you install a single tracker or dashcam, there is a crucial, mandatory step you have to take. It's called a Data Protection Impact Assessment, or a DPIA. The best way to think of it is as a formal safety check for your employees' privacy.
This really highlights a core principle of GDPR: data protection by design and by default. What that means is privacy can't just be an afterthought you tack on at the end. It has to be baked into your systems right from the very beginning.
So the big question is, when do you actually have to do one of these? Well, when it comes to fleet management, the answer is pretty much always.
You see, a DPIA is required when you're doing systematic monitoring.
when you're processing data of what GDPR calls vulnerable subjects, and yes, employees count because of that power imbalance, or when you use new technology. I mean, vehicle tracking often hits all three of those criteria, which makes doing a DPIA a mandatory first step. And the process itself isn't as scary as it sounds. You can break it down into 4 clear steps. First, just describe what you're doing and why. Second, explain why it's truly necessary and proportionate. Third, really think about and assess the risks to your employees. And finally, number 4, list out the concrete measures you'll put in place to manage and reduce those risks.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground. So let's bring it all home with a final compliance checklist, just hitting the absolute key takeaways you need to remember.
Okay, first, your legal basis. Remember, it's almost always going to be legitimate interest, not consent. Be completely transparent with your people. Only collect the data you absolutely need, nothing more. If there's private use, you need a privacy switch. Keep that dashcam audio off by default. And always, always, always complete a DPIA before you get started.
So at the end of the day, as your fleet is out there on the road, you have to ask yourself, is our data policy on the right track too? Are we actually protecting our business and honoring the rights of our employees? It's a critical question and one you need to be able to answer with a very confident yes.